This is very exciting. Joining me on the Unsolicited Response Show is Eric Cosman. Eric had a 38-year career at Dow Chemical, ending, I guess your last role was as the Engineering Solutions Architect in 2014.
That's correct. You've done your research. Yep.
Yes, and then you quote, retired, but it really was just a second career for you because Eric is now a contributing consultant at ARC Advisory Group, and if anything, has increased his leadership role in ISA. Eric Cosman was one of the first people. He was with ISA 99 when it began in those very first meetings. He's been with it throughout its lifetime and has been a co-chair there for many years. And I guess the last thing to say about ISA is you were actually president of ISA in 2020.
Yeah, so the year that didn't happen because of COVID. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to talk to you a little bit about that, but let's start back at Dow.
Okay.
Because I remember, now you and I haven't had a lot of long conversations, but probably the longest conversation I had with you, and you probably don't remember it because I was so new to the industry, but we were at a Microsoft Manufacturing Users Group in Redmond back in like 2002 or 2004, 2005 timeframe or something like that. And
yep.
Microsoft was considering at the time whether they should create a special version of Windows for manufacturing, which of course they decided against, probably wisely.
Wisely, I think. Yeah, that was an interesting. I still tell people that story, but yeah.
Yeah, but on that bus ride, one of the things we talked about quite a bit, and it was just amazing to me, was the fact that Dow Chemical had its own control system, that you developed your own control system, your own safety system that was called the Manufacturing Operating Discipline, MOD.
Correct.
And again, I did some research on that. It was first deployed in 1969, Mod 1. Yep. The last version that actually got deployed widely, Mod 5, came out in 1980, and by 2000 had over 1,500 deployed. So I was shocked back in 2004 or so, you still had all these Dow Chemical developed ICS running your processes, manufacturing your product. When did that mod system finally get decommissioned?
Actually, I've been retired now for 8 years. So my facts may be a little out of date, but I wouldn't be surprised if they still have a few running. One of the last projects I worked on before I retired was on the mod replacement project. And at that time, we were predicting that the last mods would not shut down until 2030.
Really? So at 2014, there were still many of them out there.
Oh, yes, many, many. Now, one of the things, serendipity being what it is, one of the things that helped us is that when Dow went through its many corporate reorganizations and restructuring through the merger with DuPont and then the subsequent spinoff, businesses got sold to other companies. And other companies, non-Dow companies, as you can imagine, had a much higher incentive to get rid of the Mod 5. So it started back in around the late 1990s when we spun off our, I say we, but when Dow spun off their consumer products division to SC Johnson. The first thing that SC Johnson did was went through all their plants that they acquired, that they got through the acquisition, and systematically ripped out the Mod 5s. The interesting thing about that is that the built into the agreements, divestiture agreements, were that when the buying company decommissioned the Mod 5s, the equipment was returned to Dow.
Huh. So that increased the lifespan of your products with all those spares.
Yeah.
When did they start? Do you know when the first Mod 5 was pulled out and was replaced by ABB or whatever you chose?
Well, as I said, companies like SC Johnson were the first to do that, but replacement with ABB, it was before I retired. So it would have been somewhere in, I'm guessing now, because I can't remember exactly, but I would say somewhere in the 2009, 2010 timeframe.
It's funny.
Mainly that was because we had to wait for the ABB system to meet our requirements.
And it was funny when you say that. It makes sense now, because when I was trying to figure out what Dow replaced it with, I saw examples of Delta V replacing mod, and all these other companies replacing mod. But that might have been because SC Johnson or someone else who bought it chose to replace it with that, as opposed to the Dow chosen replacement.
Well, the reason for that, primarily as far as Dow is concerned, keeping our scope with Dow for a moment, is that Dow, I'll give you a bit of history that you might have picked up in your research. It began with when Dow acquired Union Carbide in 2000. Mm-hmm. And then we acquired Roman Haas in 2008. And both of those companies, as you might expect, had different choices for their control systems.
Okay.
And so as part of the acquisition, we merged former Dow facilities into with former acquired company facilities. And since the business units got to call the shots, for example, some of the businesses that were legacy Roman Haas were already well instantiated with Delta V. So when they did the replacement, they would do it with Delta V. When we started the Mod 5 migration project, we naively assumed that we would just replace all of our mods with ABB.
Yeah.
Clearly, mergers and acquisitions have an interesting way of changing your plans.
Well, and we see that across almost all the companies where these goals to standardize on one control system doesn't tend to last very long. In years, they just acquire things, and it's almost impossible to do.
In our case, it was about 10 years. I used to joke that we went from, in the space of about a decade, we went from a company that was virtually all one system to a company that had pretty much one of everything. One or more of everything.
I'm a little curious, before we move on from Dow, we deal with so much with culture in OT security. In making that transition, what were some of the, and I'm not talking about individuals, but what were some of the roles that were the biggest proponents of moving away from Dow or from mod, and some of the biggest, let's say, laggards who fought it tooth and nail moving away from mod?
Well, first, it's important to understand that when we made the decision to move away from the Mod 5, prior to that, we already had a direction to move to the Mod 6.
Yeah, I saw that.
And basically what happened was the then vice president of operations commissioned a very detailed study of what it would take to financially to complete the Mod 6. And then he took that number to the businesses and said, "Are you willing to pay this?" And they said no.
Oh.
So the Mod 6 project died. And then it was, okay, we got to replace the Mod 5 with something eventually. And so we then started a project to look for a partner. And we chose one company first, and that relationship exploded. And I won't and can't go into details because even to this day, I'm not allowed to speak about that. But then we settled basically on the ABB system. And that's, you could say it was mandated. But that mandate created a groundswell of support, primarily among the technical community, because they were excited about getting on the ground floor of a new system. Keep in mind, when we selected ABB, the industrial 800XA wasn't even close to being complete. So we helped them develop it. We licensed our technology to them. So the ones that I would say in general, the people that, I don't want to say resisted because it wasn't active resistance, it wasn't even passive resistance, but the ones that were maybe tougher to convert, frankly, were the people that were very happy with what the mod did for them. And they had built their, this is a Dow term now, most effective technology on a business basis around the mod. Similar to ExxonMobil and Honeywell, if you're familiar with that situation.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
and I mean, there's a company that's going through the same thing right now. So.
Well, yeah, and we're gonna pivot to them in a second. One last mod question: and you haven't been in Dow for 8-9 years now,
right?
But
I still stay in touch though.
But you say there's still probably some Dow sites that are running mod.
I would guess so, but I don't know that for a fact.
If they were still doing it now, would that be? Do you think, in the general case, would that be a case of stubbornness, or do you think there would still be reasonable business drivers to be continuing to do it that way?
It's business drivers. It's not, the stubbornness is gone. It's basically a hard-headed business decision.
Okay.
As you can imagine, rip and replace a control system is not a trivial exercise, because it has implications. It has ripple effects in instrumentation. It has ripple effects in control room design. It has, and the list goes on. Because keep in mind, our mod system was the controllers, the instrumentation, the battery backup, the user interface. I mean, it was everything.
Well, and you even in the notes, it said that it was one of the first systems, if not the first system, to have a separate safety system and control system. So
yes,
you had that as well. So it was quite a complete offering.
We were
really impressive.
Certified by TUV as an integrated control and safety system back in about mid-1990s.
Okay, well, now I'm going to transition to modern day, and
okay,
and I think I have a way of doing this, because I found it amusing that in an article in Automation, the top automation trends for 2022, your number one was the value of open automation.
Yes,
and you particularly pointed to the Open Process Automation Forum.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the polar opposite of the mod approach, right? Where
Yeah.
you're locked into one, you do it all yourself. You're responsible for everything from engineering to maintenance to support, everything. And now you're saying that you see a trend in the industry to move to this idea of having an interoperable system. So you're not locked into ExxonMobil's big into this. You're not locked into
Right.
Honeywell in their case. Not that
Yeah.
they say they're moving away from Honeywell, but they just don't like the lock-in component of it.
Right.
And I know ARC has really been, I don't want to say promoting, but you've been covering this quite a bit in the forum that you have every Q1, that they get a big chunk of time to talk about what it is, what they're doing, what the progress is.
Yeah, we have. I'll switch my definition of the we pronoun now to ARC, and I don't speak for ARC. I'm just a contractor, but
right.
ARC has a not full time, but one of their senior analysts that covers OPA, dedicated to cover OPA, and then I fill in primarily in the area of security, but in other areas as well.
Well, what would you say, because you've learned a lot about it, what's the biggest success they've had to date, if you were to point to one thing that's worked well?
Well, that's a really good question. You can answer that in a variety of ways. I mean, you could answer it from the point of view of technology development, or you could answer it from the point of view of acceptance. Technology development, I don't think, is a major factor, because they're not really setting out to create new technology. Whenever possible, they're adopting and adapting what's already there. For example, they've adopted 62443 as their security specification. They've adopted the variety of things like OPC and that sort of thing. I think their success has been, and I'm speculating now, but I think when Honeywell embarked on this, when ExxonMobil embarked on this, they weren't sure how much uptake they would get from other companies. And while there's always an opportunity for more of that, I think they've been very pleased with the fact that the industry is sort of coming around. Maybe a little bit to the chagrin of some of the control systems companies, but I think even they're coming around, to tell you the truth.
Have there been some case studies that they've had at ARC or elsewhere where they've said, we have deployed this DCS and we got the controller from this company, we got the engineering workstation from this company, we got, these other components from this company?
I think most of their public case studies to date have been more than proof of concept, but in lab facilities. And the best person to ask that, frankly, would be, I just don't know. I'm not up to date on what's going on internally in ExxonMobil, but I almost guarantee ExxonMobil would be leading in this area. And Don Bartusiak
Yep.
would be able to answer that much better than I can.
I think he's retired from there now. Hasn't he? He's out on his own.
He's created his own company basically to further OPA.
Okay.
So
Well, we'll probably have to do an episode on that. But just from your point of view, do you think the economic incentives are there? I would be hard pressed if I'm Honeywell to be too crazy about this.
no,
You know, so
or Emerson for that matter, but yeah,
or Yokogawa. But Yokogawa seems to be playing a little bit more. You almost have to play. You know, but you're in the standards world. We'll talk more about that later. Sometimes people play in that arena on defense as much as they do on offense.
Yes,
and
agreed.
I wonder about that. But what do you think about the economic incentives?
I think the case can be made. I think it has been made in a generic sense. They wouldn't have got as far as they have if they weren't able to make the case. I know that ExxonMobil is convinced. I know that Chevron is convinced, and some of the other big asset owners, primarily in the oil and gas business, that are promoting it. But they, at the same time, they're not naive. They realize that it is a long journey, and it's one thing to make the business case for adjusting the track of your company strategy. That is entirely different from making the business case of ripping out a particular existing system and replacing it. So both of those are tough cases, but they're very, very different. So for example, using my Dow example, the one we always used to like to use as an example is an ethane cracker, or a light hydrocarbons plant, as we called them in Dow. They're huge. Absolutely huge. Every bit as big or bigger than an oil refinery. And changing those things out is, well, first of all, these are plants that only shut down every 7 years. And so you've got to really go with a long-term plan. And I think, by the way, I think one of the secrets to success is plotting a path, a strategy that allows you to do incremental conversion. The so-called rip and replace, except for the smallest of facilities, is really not a, it doesn't fly.
Well, so, and in theory, if you had let's say a DCS that was meeting some of these specifications, and do they call it OPAF? I don't know how they call it, but
some people call it OPAF. Yeah.
In OPAF, then in theory, you could pull out a controller and HMI or something like that and replace it with, so you could take an existing system from all one vendor and retrofit it. And in fact, we've seen that in control systems quite a bit. We've seen people put new HMIs on as front ends. There's been whole business models of that.
To use my light hydrocarbon example, light hydrocarbons plants are, they have what's called a hot section and a cold section. And of course, multiple subunits underneath that. I'm a chemical engineer by training, so we would call those unit operations. And you'd convert a unit operation, maybe the cold section first, or maybe the hot section, the furnaces first, or whatever makes most sense from an engineering perspective.
And we do see something like that and maybe you have this in manufacturing as well, but in electric or in chemical as well, but in electric, you have a lot of balance of plant systems. So you have the DCS, and then you have a bunch of Rockwell or something else running the boiler or something like that. So it's interesting. I will tell you that what I've been most interested in terms of the concrete results coming out of this is some of the most active vendors in OPAF are really showing some great things in terms of orchestration, the ability to rebuild a system quickly, in a matter of minutes or hours, as opposed to days, weeks, or months. And I really like that, but we'll have to keep an eye on that.
Well, I think, one of the advantages of being an old guy like I am is that you have a longer perspective. And a lot of that kind of flexibility started to come about with the adoption of commercial off-the-shelf technology by control systems companies back 30 years ago.
Yeah, back in the 90s, kicking and screaming and the whole Ethernet, or can I use a
Yeah.
Windows computer and all that stuff. Yeah.
I mean, companies like Wonderware and, other companies demonstrated you can do a lot with this Windows toy that most control engineers just thought it was a toy.
Right. Well, let's talk ISA. I mean,
Okay.
I think people would be disappointed given what I write about ISA. If we didn't have it, they'd think I was ducking the topic. But
Okay.
I have kind of a love-hate relationship with the organization, and they with me sometimes, or the individuals. I shouldn't say the organization. But
Well, if it's any consolation, we have those kind of debates internally as well.
yeah. Well, and for those that don't know, ISA 99 is really the driver of the 62443 standards. I mean, they are called ISA IEC 62443, but it's really this ISA 99 group that does most of the heavy lifting in creating them, managing them. You had on Andrew Ginter's podcast, and I think elsewhere, you've said that the 62443 standards are primarily engineering standards.
Yes.
And it didn't sound like that was a throwaway line. It sounded
Nope.
like that was a line that meant something to you. So how is that an important differentiator? Or how should we view that statement? Maybe give us a little context what you mean there.
Well, one of the fundamental tenets behind the philosophy in 62443 from the very beginning has been that we have to view this challenge, this task of securing, pick a term, industrial control systems, IECS, cyber physical systems,
Right.
whatever term you want to use, securing these systems first and foremost from an engineering perspective. Yes, they have information in them, but you have to go back to the fundamentals. And I don't want to get into debates over IT, OT, because frankly, those terms drive me crazy. But you have to remember what the purpose of these systems is. And the purpose is to maintain safe, reliable, resilient operations. And I say this because of my background. I'm a child of the Dow philosophy, which was a control engineer is a chemical engineer first. Okay. It's a process engineer. It could be other industries, but basically a process engineer. So if you're going to control the process, you need to understand the process at a very visceral level. And extending that, if you're going to secure the control system that's controlling the process, you need to understand the process system and the control basics. And fortunately, I am really gratified by this, that when we started 62443, or at that time ISA 99, the committee, it was very much two different camps, as you know, information security and these upstart security guys out of automation. And now we're seeing so much more cross-pollination, whether it's somebody with a IT security background wanting to learn more about cyber physical systems, or whether it's an instrumentation and controls engineer wanting to learn more about security and IT. A lot of those barriers are breaking down. So that's kind of what I meant by that, is focus on what the task is. And it's an engineering task, right? And it brings in other factors that you may not find in your average business, securing your average business system.
But when you're talking about engineers, you're talking about like yourself, chemical engineers, mechanical engineers.
I'm talking about automation professionals.
Automation professionals. Okay.
Because I don't want to
have
disrespect the people that don't have an engineering degree. So,
okay.
Right.
Yeah, I guess that comment struck me as odd, because when I think of the risk equation, I think that engineering, or the functions that understand the system and what it does and such, have a huge impact on the consequence side of the risk equation, right? They understand what the system can do. They understand what changes can be made so that a cyber breach does not cause these bad things. They understand how to recover from it. So that side I understand, but on the likelihood side, that there is a meet in the middle there, right? Where the people who understand what a cyber attack can do have to talk to the consequence people to say, what does this really mean? Is this important? Or is this, if I change this panel, it's no big deal because it's connected to something that doesn't matter.
Right.
And also they have to inform them that say, look, you think this soft interlock is providing you a lot of protection, but a bad guy who gets there can change it. So there is that kind of meet in the middle
Absolutely.
part. But most of what I see in the 62443 standards is really classic security controls to reduce likelihood. That I can't imagine a lot of engineers. They go to school to be engineers, not to be security professionals and worry about patching and network architecture. I mean, a few have crossed over, but as a rule, that's not what they want to do. So I guess I was having trouble with this being for engineers. When I read it, it sounds like it's more for someone like me than for an engineer.
Well, that's interesting. It's that's a very subtle point, but a very important one. It's directed at engineers, but by necessity, you have to explain to engineers the concepts of security and how this applies to them, right? And some companies, prior to 62443 being as mature as it is today, and certainly my previous employer was one of those companies, we basically sat down some IT security folks and some IT operations people and some automation engineers and even some production engineers in a room together, and basically made it very clear to them that there's no such thing as a hole in your end of the boat, and that you have to work together to make this happen. And that's really, I think, what 62443 is trying to do. It's one of the reasons, for example, that we very diligently try to get the point across to people that we're not here to replace IT security standards like 27,000. Mm-hmm. We're here to complement them. And we'll use 27,000 the profession, will use 27,000 where it applies. But we strongly recommend, and a lot more companies are doing this now, including my former employer, but a lot of others. They put together an operations security program that includes all of those disciplines. Okay. And they work intimately together. Unfortunately, there are still people out there that will throw rocks at an IT person even approaching their front gate. But that's becoming much less of an issue, I think.
Oh, yeah. I mean, a lot of that's aging out, just quite frankly, and I will also say that a lot of people have seen the light. A lot of people have changed. So that's great. One other area that kind of talking about this cross-pollination between disciplines is the safety and security issue.
Oh, yeah.
And I know, and this is
that this morning.
This comes from, I mean, this is kind of ISA's heritage, right? You had safety standards. And I know for a while there were these security assurance levels were actually going to try to mimic the SILs in terms of having mathematical rigor and such. And there's always
we learned pretty quickly that wasn't possible. So
that was difficult. And there's always this effort, people saying, why can't we do what worked in safety and apply it to security? And I know some people still say that. Where are you on this? What can security take effectively from safety, and what would be maybe some things that, look, it's just different, this does not transfer?
Well, the first thing I think that people have to understand is that compromises in safety are a possible consequence of compromises in security.
Sure.
Okay, so that's important for people to understand. That's why they're connected. Mm-hmm. What can we take from safety? I think one of them is just the discipline, the rigorous discipline that's put into designing a safety system. Safety engineers use, I'm losing the terminology now, but they calculate probability of failure on demand, and they do very, very detailed analysis of all of the possible scenarios. And that's why we, in 62443, we have a standard dedicated to risk assessment. And it was primarily authored by John Cosman, whose background is in safety.
Yeah.
To bring that kind of discipline. Now, what's different? Safety, you can predict this probability of failure on demand based on exactly that, mathematics. In security, you can't. And some have argued that the probability factor of the risk equation in security really should be 1, because it's going to happen. It's just a question.
Where are you on that argument?
I think the potential is probably 1, but the probability of it actually occurring used to be vanishingly small, but unfortunately is getting higher all the time. And that's simply because the adversaries out there are realizing that they can gain by compromising an industrial process, whether it's ransomware or whatever. I won't even go into some of the nefarious, darker motives. But so, there was a time when industrial systems were sort of sitting there fat, dumb, and happy, and they weren't connected to anything, and they didn't really care about what went on in the world. And well, that's way behind us now. Yeah. So those people who are responsible for those systems just need to understand it. It's another threat vector that if they've been in the business as long as I have 30 years ago, they might not have considered it.
Yeah, I think it's always difficult, though, and I wouldn't want to go in front of a board with this probability of 1 statement, because then the board's going to say, well, why should I spend any money to reduce the likelihood of it happening, when you say I have to assume the likelihood is 100%. Well, and that's why you get in that logical circle that gets difficult.
That's why were I making such a case, and I have made such a case in the past, my argument would be you're not trying to reduce the likelihood of it happening. You're trying to increase the resilience in case it does, and mitigate the impact. That's really what it's all about.
But then again, that gets us back to consequence reduction, primarily recovery, things of that nature, not your classic good practice security controls that we hear about. But
agreed. It's really, like I say, it's really about risk mitigation.
Yeah.
I mean, at a fundamental level, when you look at risk analysis, you only have a couple of basic choices, right? You can mitigate the risk, you can accept the risk, or you can eliminate the risk. And it's really unlikely that you're going to eliminate it because of that, all those other factors. So now it's, am I going to mitigate it, or am I going to accept it? Mm-hmm. And if the consequences are minor enough, you might just accept it.
Sure.
Am I worried about somebody compromising a plant that makes tomato ketchup? Maybe not. Am I worried about somebody compromising a plant that has phosgene as an intermediate chemical? Yeah, a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go to 2020. You mentioned this at the start. You became ISA president, which is quite the honor, but then that happened, and then COVID happened. And so most of your presidency was with COVID, but you put out a number of ISA president messages during that time. And one of the things that you talked about was, what is ISA? In a big thing. And you boiled it down to the home of automation. And you said, my personal vision is that of our society providing a place where all who have chosen to work in the automation profession can come and find like-minded people who are willing to teach, coach, share their experiences, and learn from their peers.
Correct.
Which sounds, I like it. Sounds great.
Yep.
I think it's a good goal. In the security area, I might be missing something, but in the security area, I primarily see the standards work.
Yeah.
Which is, I guess you are getting together and sharing via these documents. But are there other activities going on in ISA that are helping to achieve some of those things in terms of, being the home of automation and sharing and learning?
Yeah, there are several. As you may know, you probably know that ISA has a fairly robust, or mature, maybe is a better word, set of training programs in security that we offer to anyone, but primarily to members, to allow them to get grounded in the area and get certificates for their training. And I think there's 31 through 37 or something like that for the practitioners. And it teaches them the principles that are captured in 6443, as well as the practices that are won through hard experience. So that's one, training
Okay.
and I would call professional development.
Mhm.
You also know, I'm sure, that ISA has this thing called the Security Compliance Institute, which is, I think the proper word rather than compliance is conformance. But
Mhm.
basically, that group is charged with developing a set of conformance specifications that suppliers can use to say, we meet the expectations, the requirements of 62443. And then the other big one I would mention is there's another group within ISA called the Global Cybersecurity Alliance, GCA. And it is primarily about promotion, awareness and promotion,
Mhm.
making people understand why cybersecurity is important in not just process industries, but basically in industrial applications. And then lastly, we do a little of this, but not too much, advocacy with government and agencies and stuff like that. We've done that's gone up and down over the years, but and then I guess the other thing I'll mention is the sort of an extension of the training aspect of it is competency development, so that we can. I see ISA exactly as you said, the home of automation. If we're the home of automation, just the same way as IEEE is the home of electrical engineers, electronics engineers,
Mhm.
or the Society for Civil Engineers for civil engineers, and so on, then it is incumbent upon us to help people understand what it takes to be a successful automation professional. And as I said earlier, that's not limited to engineers, because a large part of our members are technicians
Mhm.
with 2-year degrees. And so, we provide services to them in exactly the same way as people with people who are engineers with 4-year degrees or PhDs or whatever.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you had a chance to give that overview, because I
Yeah,
think many people just think of the 62443 standards, because
right.
that's where, quite frankly, and I want to ask a hard question, but I also want to give a lot of credit. 62443 was one of the first out working on this problem.
Hmm.
You've got huge amounts of talent. Well, not huge, but a core group of talented people that changes over the years and decades,
Yep.
spending a lot of their hours on this. Some on
All
the company
volunteer.
time. Some companies, allow them to do
Yeah.
this. Many of them do it on their,
Yeah.
their 50th and 60th hour. They do this
Yeah.
kind of work. Uh, and I think that if you were to look at the set of documents, some have bristled at how I how I put this, but I would say it is the most comprehensive set of conservative consensus on what to do. I mean,
Hmm.
consensus, people don't. Some people bristled on consensus, but it's a consensus-based process, so I don't
That's
think
right.
you can really fight that. People push back a little on conservative. I tend to think it's conservative because it's a conservative group, and you've got to get enough people to agree this is right. So you're
Yeah.
not going to. It's not going to be the early adopter view, because it's the early adopters are not the majority to get you where you
Right.
need to be. So feel free to push back on that. But the question I have is, you've got all this great work um, that I've argued for a while has been underappreciated, underutilized. And if we look, I mean, I would say in many ways, U.S. government guidance has kind of surpassed ISA, in my view, as the go-to place. And SANS, their training, if you look at their numbers, they're training many, many more people than ISA
Hmm.
has done. If you agree, what's gone wrong? What have we missed that 20-year effort isn't being fully leveraged for its leadership position? And whether you agree with that or not, is there anything that you're looking to change to have this good work make a bigger impact?
Well, I would agree with you to a point. A couple of points you mentioned that I just want to pick up on.
Okay.
First of all, I think you called it conservative. You used the terms conservative and consensus. You're right. Standards are by definition consensus based.
Hmm.
That's We are accredited by the American National Standards Institute, which says your standards will be consensus based. We work closely with the IEC, which says right in their charter, consensus based. So that's a given. The conservative part, I think that engineers as a species are pretty conservative anyway. Okay, let's put that right out there. I think most people agree with that, unless they're research engineers. Mm-hmm. But my answer to the conservative part would be that industry standards almost by necessity. And if you've ever been or worked with somebody who's been an expert witness in a trial proceeding, you're there to represent what is common accepted engineering practice. Mm-hmm. All right. And what that means, it's already been proven. And standards in some ways do exactly the same thing. They codify common and accepted engineering practice. Now, having said that, there are people in the standards committees that in the nature of their day job are looking further ahead, and they do bring in some more forward-looking thinking, and we try to accommodate that in the standard as best we can. Mm-hmm. But again, that consensus thing comes up. So now getting back to your question about
just one thing before that. Okay. When I wrote that, I didn't mean that as a negative. Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, that seemed to be the reason the organization existed. Now, yes. Oftentimes it doesn't agree with my point of view.
Right.
But, yeah. I don't think I'm probably, I don't run a plant, right. And most of my clients that I have worked with are very early adopters. Right. They want to be on the leading edge. They're not. Yeah. They're not the ones that say, I want other people to show me that it works, and after 5 right. years, and then I'll do it. So I think that that conservative consensus documentation is needed. It's not a bad thing to have such a set of documents. So that's why I was kind of a little surprised when people bristled at it, but I think it might have been some of my other words around it that kind of put them in a sour mood to that term.
That could be.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the effectiveness of it. I'm sorry I interrupted you there, but.
No, you asked, in leading up to this, you asked the question, what could we, in hindsight, with 20 years of hindsight, what could we have done differently? And what should we still consider doing differently? Mm-hmm. ISA as an organization is multifaceted. It is, in the development of our standards, we are a standards development organization, SDO, that's accredited by ANSI. But we are also and that's largely in the context of the United States, because ANSI is an American organization. Mm-hmm. In speaking in terms of ISA as an engineering society, we are international, and we have probably at least as many members outside the U.S. as we have inside the U.S. I don't know exactly what those numbers are, but I know most of our growth is coming from outside the U.S. So when you answer that question from a society perspective or from a standards perspective, the answers are a little bit different. But in general, I would say that we ISA recognize the need for more advocacy and promotion and encouragement of acceptance. That's why we formed the Global Cybersecurity Alliance. Mm-hmm. We recognize the need for having unambiguous conformance specifications. So and believe me, I've faced suppliers who make these claims, say, we're compliant with ISA 123, and don't even realize that that's not a compliant standard, and haven't read it. So that's why we formed the Compliance Institute. Meanwhile, allowing the standards committee to focus on what it's here to do, which is develop the standard. Now, coordinating all those activities is a challenge in and of itself. Mm-hmm. And I didn't mention training and not training, but I'll call it professional development. So when we started the committee, none of those other things existed. Had we realized back in 2002, October of 2002 in Chicago, to be precise, we might have started some of those other things sooner. But and this is this is a bit of a story, I guess, but in that meeting in October 2002, if you can believe it, we sat down, a bunch of us sat down and said, well, first of all, ISA made a decision, a fundamental decision, Standards and Practices Board, said cybersecurity is an emerging thing, and we have two options. We can tell all of our existing standards committees that they have to incorporate security in their subject matter, or we can form a new committee. Well, we formed a new committee. Well, we sat down to form that committee, and we naively assumed, if you can believe this, that we could meet the need with 2 standards and 2 technical reports. Total, maybe less than 100 pages. Okay. Well, obviously that's not the case. So we learned as we went. And as we went, the society learned the importance of things like conformance, promotion, advocacy is a better word than promotion. Promotion sounds too self-serving. Career development, all those other things. So, had we had perfect foresight, we probably would have started a lot of those much sooner.
Yeah, I could see if that stuff started in, it wouldn't have had to been 2002, but let's say 2008 or even as late as 2013.
Yeah.
Then maybe it would have been leaned on heavily by the U.S. government. It would have been leaned on heavily. The training program could have been the training program. And I'll acknowledge there certainly have been strides in that advocacy and awareness efforts in the last 2 years, I think, especially. But has the ship sailed? Do you see this being able to regain that position? Because there isn't a set of documents comparable, but again, things move fast, and we see all these U.S. government documents being created on their own out of.
Well, I tend to be pretty optimistic by nature, and I think that while people may not recognize it based on observing it, we ISA have very strong relationships with NIST, with several of the national labs that we're working with them, and other organizations trying to avoid duplication of effort, trying to leverage what's already available in either direction. So, for example, NIST, NIST 800, whatever that number is, 82? No, whatever it is. When that was originally written, it borrowed a lot of the concepts from 6443, and we've kept close to that ever since. In the NIST framework, for example, we work closely with people working on the NIST framework, and we've got some work going on right now with some people from Idaho Labs on basically competency development, because the bottom line is these organizations have resources that we don't have. Okay. ISA, at the end of the day, ISA is not a very big company. Okay. I won't mention numbers, but it's not a very big company. It has tens of thousands of members, but a company in terms of putting resources to bear on a problem, it's pretty small. So we try to use our presence, our expertise, our influence. And I'm only speaking for myself here, but at the end of the day, I don't really care a whole lot who gets the credit. As long as the profession ups its game.
I've seen a lot of the crosswalks that you've talked about, like certainly the cybersecurity framework references 62443 for the various sub requirements and such. The one that in doing a little research that sounded like it might be a more direct influence was I saw that the electric energy OT security profile that the Department of Energy requested. Now that actually, I think they tasked ISA with creating a document that then will be I don't know if it will be the document, but it's designed to be an important document telling the electric sector what they should do. Are there other examples of that, or is that kind of the first one that we've seen?
No, there are other examples. First of all, let me just elaborate on what you just said. The group that you talked about, just for the record, is ISA 99 Work Group 14. And they are charged with developing a profile where the word profile has a very specific definition in 62443 for their sector. Okay. And so they're working, they've only been in existence about a year. So, they're just sort of getting going, if you will, because this stuff takes time. To your question, yes, there have been other similar cases, both formal and informal in the past. None of them were formally sanctioned or were officially sanctioned as part of ISA 99 because, frankly, at the time, we didn't really have our act together about what forming such a profile group would entail. But I worked with, this goes back a few years, I worked with a gentleman on developing what today, using today's vernacular, we would call a profile for primarily medical facilities. There was one developed by another member of the committee as part of his consulting practice for rail transportation. And more recently, one of our members has been working on, and I think it might already be published, but if it's not, it's very close to being published, for building automation. So and I forgot to mention, when I mentioned rail, the gentleman I've referred to did it for rail in the US. And then at the same time, there was a similar activity in Europe for rail transportation in Europe.
Yeah, I think those are all, like most of the documents that come out they're valuable additions to the, to provide
the body of
context
knowledge
and such. I think the DOE one is so interesting because then that would be DOE somehow, blessing it and pointing people at this, which I think increases the impact beyond just the value of the information going out there.
I agree, and I'm very hopeful that it will make that difference because, and this because of your background watching this space. We tried many times over the years to get the energy sector engaged, and we pretty much were put off by, no, we're different, and we don't need 6443. We have NERC-CIP and that kind of thing. So this is a pretty radical departure, and I'm very hopeful that it's going to be a positive one.
Well, Eric Cosman, now with ARC Advisory Group and very active in ISA. I've kept you for about 50 minutes here, but before we go, I just want to ask you one last question. Is there something that you're passionate about that we haven't talked about? Like where you're saying, this is something that, I think about, I'm advocating for heavily that you'd raise here. And it's not necessary, but if there is some, I'd be curious what it is.
Well, it sounds trite. What would be really trite is, I would say, other than my granddaughter, but it sounds trite. But what I'm passionate about, I'm at a point in my life where I'm retired. My professional career, other than volunteer work and a little bit of part-time consulting with ARC, is behind me. I can pick and choose where to spend my hours, whether I charge for them or not. But my passion is giving back. And I want to develop the profession in the same way that I was privileged to develop my career over the years. I had the benefit of learning from some wonderful mentors. And so mentoring is part of it. The other one is advocating for the profession, not just security, but profession in general, why automation is important. And that goes down to something as simple as explaining to a United States Senator what automation was, which was an interesting experience. So that's my passion, basically, is the profession that's been so good to me.
Okay. And if someone wanted to reach out to you, are you active on any of the socials? Do you monitor your LinkedIn?
You can find me. I'm on Facebook. That's primarily for kids or family and stuff, but you can find me on LinkedIn.
Okay.
You can find me. My email address is really simple. It's eric.cosman@gmail.com. That's one of my many email addresses. But that's the one I use for my standards work.
Okay.
And then I have my own little consulting company that from time to time, I get an opportunity to do some sort of independent engagement. I don't really push for this, or market it, but it's eric.cosman@oitconcepts.com.
Right. I was looking for that website, so there's no website for that.
There is, but there's nothing there. It's really, I had great intentions when I retired. I realized pretty quickly I'm not a website designer.
Well, and my guess is your time you have more people asking for your time than you have time. So
Yeah.
it's probably one of the luxuries of being able to pick and choose. So you
Well,
don't
what I
need
tell
all the work.
people is I'm a consultant, but I'm not an eat what you kill consultant.
Yeah,
I don't have to do it to live. Okay.
that's nice.
So financially, I'm okay.
Well, Eric, thank you very much for being on the show. It's long overdue, and thank you for all the work you've done for the
Well, you're
profession,
very
for the
welcome.
community. It's I know you're not one who goes out there and does a lot of self promotion, but you've put
No.
in a lot of hours helping a lot of people in the community, and I know people appreciate it.